This is the lecture for Wednesday, the 7th of April, 2021, for European history. Where we were was the conflicting motives of the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who was, on the one hand, quite cognizant of the fact that most British leaders around him, in his cabinet, in his parliament, wanted a generous peace with the Germans, akin to the peace made with France in the 1815 Congress of Vienna. In order to invite the new German government, the Weimar Republic, which we'll talk a lot more about later, into the new system in a way that won't make the German people resentful. Remember, it was against Bismarck's advice that the German Empire took Alsace and Lorraine from France. It was at the insistence of General von Moltke and the military, who wanted the Vosges Mountains west of the Rhine as his jumping-off point for the next war. Bismarck said, "This will embitter the French." Nobody listened to him. It's one of the battles he lost. And the result was that, plus the indemnity, but particularly the loss of territory, infuriated the French and made them into basically a permanent, vitriolic, energetic, and perpetual enemy to the new German Empire. This didn't have to happen. Bismarck knew that. He spent the rest of his political life trying to keep France isolated because he knew the first chance France would get, they would slice and dice on Germany. And even though Germany might win, it would still be a disaster. Germany had achieved its goals. It had become united. Lloyd George and the British knew this. They also knew that in their experience with the Boers, it was wise to make a generous peace. You establish firm victory, so there's no question of who's the boss. And then, after you do that, you open things up. You're generous. You structure things so that if the enemy, the former enemy, wants to play ball with you, they can do so. And if they prove a willingness to cooperate, they'll get more and more power. In other words, they will achieve through peaceful means and through cooperation what they couldn't achieve through force of arms. This is a wise approach when you can to be magnanimous in victory. The problem is that too much blood had been spilled, and so there was a lot of anger about the war, and that anger was going to be directed at the loser or the enemy. But the real problem was money, because Lloyd George had promised the British that they would be that they would not foot the bill, that the bills that Britain owed to America's banks would be paid by the losers, Germany. But thanks to Woodrow Wilson's emphasis on creating and developing beyond the world court this concept of international standards and rules and law, it wasn't enough to simply say we won the war, pay us an indemnity. The Germans have to have, or they have to be presented with a legal argument and a moral argument that makes it right and just, and not simply a matter of might makes right, that they pay for the war. So Lloyd George's solution is the war guilt clause, a clause in the Treaty of Versailles that says that Germany admits responsibility for causing World War I. There are some national peoples, national cultures, that could accept that and not be obsessed with it. Not Germany. The Germans as a people, as a general rule, there are always exceptions when you're talking this way, but the Germans as a people are a bunch of anal retentive rules junkies. And what that means is they are absolutely committed to the notion of living a life in order. And that means everything in its place and a place for everything. It means neat households. It means very productive workplaces. It means relatively crime-free streets, relatively. But it also means that the laws being scrupulously obeyed matter to them in a way that they wouldn't necessarily to a loosey-goosey American who's willing to defy the government whenever the government irritates them. And I've lived this, I understand, both in terms of having gone faster than 55, when 55 miles an hour was the national speed limit, and in the most recent mask controversy, because off campus, with one or two exceptions, I refuse to wear those damn things. I don't believe in them. I don't think they're effective, and I think that they're an affront to my freedom. I tried expressing this to the Kootenai Health Board, saying, please encourage us. If you ask, we're more likely to comply. But if you tell us, we are likely to defy. And that is precisely what many people in our local community did. They opposed the mask mandate by refusing, by basically massive civil disobedience. I don't like civil disobedience, but given a choice between obeying a law that I consider to be fundamentally immoral, if we were dealing with Ebola, that would be different. We're not. We're dealing with a fairly less than they expected lethal and dangerous respiratory problem. It's lethal if you have secondary conditions or if you're very old. There are a few people in the United States that have died of it who are younger, but it is not like flesh-eating bacteria. It's not like the bubonic plague or even the Spanish flu of 102 years ago. Now, I may be totally wrong about this. My doctor certainly thinks I am, and he's a thoughtful and good man. And many of you may think I'm just a moron on this issue, and I may be. I admit the possibility. But I'm raising it not to try to persuade you that masks are evil, but because I, as an American, followed a very American response to a law that I didn't agree with. I didn't obey it. And I was willing to pay a price if I had to. And I still am. On campus, I wear the mask where I have to as a condition of employment. That's a different story. But Germans, they'd obey it. In mass, they'd obey it. And then they'd have the law changed. It's a very different approach. And when you give a national culture like that a diktat that says that they will admit legal and moral responsibility for a war they didn't cause, you are setting up a situation that's going to cause massive hatred. It's bad enough that the World War was so bloody and so long and so apparently futile, and that the peace that was being built in its aftermath was so unsatisfying. That's all bad. And it's bad for Germany that it lost. But people win and lose fights all the time. Losing a struggle doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world. But the Germans were like a puppy being potty trained. One of the ways that I learned to potty train dogs is you bring the dog to where they did their business in the house, and you say no, and you show them, and you put their nose right near it, and then you bring them outside, and then you encourage them. Well, the German people were grabbed by the scruff of the neck and brought over to the mess, and their noses were put in it, and then they were told, don't, you bad German. Of course they're going to be enraged. So the need for money has some pretty bad consequences. And that's something that Lloyd George gets. He gets the war guilt clause because it's going to allow the West to demand that Germany pay for the war. Germany pays the French and the British, who then are going to pay the American banks. Ultimately, by the way, in the 1920s, in the Dawes and Young Plan, the U.S. government and American bankers extend loans to Germany so that they can pay the British and French, so that they can pay the Americans. Circular. It's a circular flow. Okay. Now we come to Le Tigre, Georges Clemenceau, a retired iconoclastic French politician who wants the Germans never again to be a threat. See, he can read a population map, and he understands that France's population is both lower than Germany's and slower growing than Germany's. And that means that Germany is going to have more workers, more soldiers, more productive people. And in wartime, that matters. And in peacetime, that matters. What Clemenceau wants to do is break up Germany into its component parts again. But the British and Americans won't go along with it. So what is he going to do? See, Clemenceau is convinced that the Germans are France's perpetual enemy. He proceeds from the assumption that because of French revanchism, Germans have been embittered, and because of the horrible nature of the war, Germans have been further embittered. And the idea of a generous peace is going to be wasted on them because they already hate us. You want to make a modern analogy to this? I remember early in the War on Terror, a bunch of my more liberal and progressive colleagues and students argued, well, we can't be too aggressive in the War on Terror because it'll just recruit more terrorists. To which my response is, A, they already hate us. Even moderate Muslims hate the existence of Israel, and they don't like the fact that the Americans bankroll and protect Israel. B, the terror group's point for existence is to incite war. So our aggression is not a significant factor in my calculations in terms of inspiring more terrorism. I believed that whatever we did, the terrorists would still strike at us as aggressively as they possibly could, and they would still recruit a lot of people from around the Islamic world who have been taught to hate as a means of getting their life to make sense. Clemenceau shared this reasoning as regards the Germans. He said, there is nothing we can do, at least in France, to make the Germans love us or to make the Germans live peaceably beside us, except carve their country into smaller pieces so that it's not this colossus looming over the rest of us. But he can't get his way. So he's going to have to settle for lesser goals. And those lesser goals are, first of all, that the Rhineland be demilitarized. The Rhineland and the areas just east of the Rhine in Alsace-Lorraine is going to be, and these are parts of Germany, this area, which you can't probably see on my, oh, maybe you can, which looks really tiny on this map, is the part of Germany that got Germans all teary-eyed and romantic in the Napoleonic Wars because it was taken away from Germany and made into France under Napoleon. The Rhineland has this significance. Wagner writes operas about Das Rheingold in his Ring Cycle, and it's not just the physical gold, it's the notion of the Rhine as the nation's river. Remember Die Wacht am Rhein, where the German patriotic song says that the Germans will make sure that the river will never be French. It is this very area, abutting France and the Low Countries, that Clemenceau insists be demilitarized. That is, no military bases, no military activity. In fact, the Allies, in the 10 years after World War I, including the United States, are going to occupy the Rhineland. The Allies are going to patrol the eastern Rhine bridges on the French border and the area of Germany west of the Rhine. No German forces other than police forces will be allowed in those parts of Germany. So the Germans are being denied the use of their own territory for their own military. Clemenceau says that this is an absolute requirement, and he gets it. Because without a militarized Rhineland, it'll be much harder for a future Germany to attack France, either directly through Alsace-Lorraine or through the Low Countries of Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland. Now, this is a loose occupation. However, Clemenceau gets another thing, another concession, in English-speaking. The Germans are going to pay money. If the Germans default, the French insist on the Allies' rights to march into the Rhineland and rule it instead of the German government until the Germans pay off their debt. And this is actually going to happen in the 1920s. So Clemenceau doesn't just take the Germans' ability to militarize the western part of their country away from Germany. Clemenceau insists that if the Germans default in their loans, not only will there be an Allied policing force in those areas, but that the French will come in and replace the German government until the money is paid. In other words, France is insisting that the peace basically involved the French holding a dagger at the Germans' throat. And he thinks it's the only way to guarantee that the Germans won't come after him.
So I get that the Germans and the French kind of hate each other, and I'm no psychologist, but I don't think that would particularly help the situation.
Well, you might be right. In fact, I am arguing that all of this stuff in raging Germany is both needless and a major cause of the Second World War. And not just that, a major cause of the rise of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. However, if you accept Clemenceau's reasoning that you can't appease the Germans, that the Germans are already a perpetual enemy, then all you can do is just keep them weak, keep them down. Now, that isn't my view, and it's not on this issue, and it's not the British or the American view. But consider where the war was fought. It wasn't fought in the United States or on British soil. For the most part, it was fought in northeastern France. It was French territory that was churned up. Verdun is deep into France. So is Amiens. So are a bunch of the other great battle sites. There's a tiny bit of Flanders in Belgium, but for the vast majority of the trench line on the Western Front, it goes through France. It's on French soil. And they also remember very clearly 1870-71 when the Germans just marched in. So you are right psychologically, assuming that the German people are capable of starting fresh, which the English-speaking peoples assume, but not the French. So it's a fundamental difference. And what it makes the peace treaty is this Janus. If you remember the Roman god Janus, Janus, whatever, is the two-headed god. So you've got the happy face of Janus and the fearsome face of Janus. And unfortunately for the world, look, had the entire Versailles Peace Conference been about punishing Germany and dividing it, it might have worked. Had the entire peace conference been about a generous peace, it might have worked. But it wasn't. It was both. A lot of the tone was sanctimonious, and a lot of the tone, that's Wilson, and a lot of the tone was generous. The tone, and that came from the British. And the British insisted that nothing fundamental be done to divide Germany. But at the same time, Germany's going to be spanked, Germany's going to admit for war guilt, Germany's going to pay for the war, Germany can't militarize the Rhineland, and if the Germans default in their loans, the French will occupy the Rhineland. But that's not all. Germans have to accept arms limitations that nobody else has to accept. For example, the German army, which had been 2 to 4 million men in peacetime, and 20 to 40, 2 to 4 million men, and as high as, I think, 8 to 10 million. Figures are, I gotta double check them. But anyway, beaucoup millions of men is limited now to 100,000 men. That's twice the population of the city of Coeur d'Alene, just a little less than. 100,000 men in Europe at that time is a National Guard police force. It's not an army. You need a couple million guys to be a plausible army for the German nation. But the French insist that the Germans not have an army larger than 100,000 men. And so they're not. Now, what the Germans are going to use is they're going to use their regular army as a training system and their reserve army is going to be semi-official, semi-unofficial, but basically they're going to feed as many young men through this 100,000-man militia as they can to give as many young Germans military training so that if there is a real war again, they can call them up. That's not all. It's not just limiting the army to 100,000 men. Germans are forbidden to have tanks. The Germans are forbidden to have submarines. All of the German Navy is to be stripped from them, except for a few pre-dreadnought battleships that were obsolete 15, 16 years before the Treaty of Versailles. They were obsolete well before World War One. So the Germans are denied a plausible army. They're denied tanks, no tanks. They're denied a military air force. And they're denied a navy, anything bigger than a coast guard. And they're denied heavy warships except for old, obsolescent Victorian-era battleships. Yeah, this isn't going to upset a country that came together thanks to Prussian militarism. Nah, it's not going to upset a country that is is a place where if an officer walks into the room, everyone stands. It's not going to be a problem at all. And again, the French insist upon this in order to make sure that the Germans are not going to be a threat. That even if they hate France because they don't have their western area militarized, because they don't have a plausible military, that the French will see a German threat long before it materializes, and Clemenceau assumes the French will march into Germany and smack the Germans around and prevent it. That is his solution, and a lot of Frenchmen support it, again, because of where the war was fought. So, these are some problems with the Treaty of Versailles as regards Germany, but that's not all. When you take the three empires that rule Central and Eastern Europe and balkanize them out of one many, you do create a power vacuum. And no little entente is enough to make it right. You still, if you want to ship from products from one part of Czechoslovakia to another part of Czechoslovakia, you still have to ship that stuff by train from Czechoslovakia to Austria to Hungary back to Czechoslovakia, because the rail networks were designed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. None of these new countries have transportation networks, established economies, or anything else that is going to make them easily a nation. They're going to have to fight every step of the way for it. And it's not just that these nations exist for their own sake. Remember, Wilson wants to set them up for their own sake, national self-determination. But the British and the French and members of the American delegation are genuinely, including Wilson, I've got to be fair, Wilson's not a communist, he's not a communist sympathizer. Everyone's afraid of Bolshevism. Everyone's afraid of communism. So these new countries in the center and the east of Europe, by forming a cordon sanitaire with against Soviet Russia, they're going to be under pressure, increasing pressure over time from the communist Russians, and eventually from the Germans as well. And they're going to be between them. Okay, what about the rest of the world? Treaty of Versailles takes away Germany's colonies. Germany loses Togoland, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, what we now call Namibia, German East Africa, what we now call Tanzania, German Papua New Guinea, which we now just call Papua New Guinea, it's north of Australia, the Bismarck Archipelago, German Samoa. German Samoa becomes the independent country of Samoa, and it's right next to American Samoa, which is still there.
It's in the name of a Girl Scout.
It's that too. It's got coconuts. Tastes like. Anyway, So Germany is stripped of its colonies. That makes sense. You know, they have no navy anyway. However, they're not just given to the people who live there. That's ridiculous. You're not going to give a bunch of illiterate natives control of a semi-modern country colony. That's beyond the ability of Europeans to conceive of at that moment in time. But you're not going to just give them to other countries, because that doesn't satisfy Wilson's new international order, his new set of international rules and laws. So what to do? The League of Nations will take possession of Germany's empire, and it will administer the territories by giving them to colonial powers as mandates. But the colonial powers will not be the owners. It will be the League of Nations in trust for the people who live there. So let's take German Southwest Africa, for example, which is right north of South Africa. German Southwest Africa is largely the Namib Desert where the meerkats live. Okay, cute little meerkats. And the South Africans are given League of Nations mandate to rule German Southwest Africa for as long as it takes. I think it's a 99-year at least or something like that, but for as long as it takes to civilize and prepare the Namibians for independence. So the South Africans, as part of the British Empire, as a condition of accepting German Southwest Africa, which, by the way, they conquered for Britain, have to accept that the League of Nations, through their mandate, is in ultimate control. They're the ultimate decision makers for Namibia. And that South Africa has a duty to prepare the native population for some kind of eventual independence or semi-independence or something like that, to civilize them. So this is the white man's burden made manifest into law. And by international law standards, it's a hell of a lot better than me conquer you because me have machine guns. It's the League of Nations assumes that the people of this land is going to be eventually worthy of independence. They will be eventually capable of civilization, and that the maintenance of this territory is a teaching mission as much as anything else, whereby the colonial power, given that League of Nations mandate, is going to make sure that the people are eventually and slowly educated, like the Romanization that happened under the Caesars. And Romanization worked. What had been divided people when they were conquered, by the time of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, they were Romans. There were Romans of all skin colors, Romans of all hair textures, Romans of all races from the Middle East, west of there. But they thought like Romans. They spoke Latin like Romans or Greek. They read the classics. They read the Iliad. They were Romans in culture and thought, word, and deed. That's what the League of Nations wanted. They wanted the native peoples to be brought into the light of civilization. In effect, on the ground, there's not much difference between being in a League of Nations mandate and being in an old-style colony. But there at least has to be maintained some pretense of education. So this is a difference. Look, it would be the same as somehow some government somewhere deciding that all the property that you own isn't yours anymore. We're just going to seize it, which, by the way, is a strike against the heart of freedom. Life, liberty, and property, don't you know? Without property, you cannot be free. Well, if the government did that, then your home, your car, your electronics would all be something that you'd rent from them. You'd pay rent on your stuff, but it wouldn't be your stuff anymore. It would be their stuff that they would let you continue to rent. As to replacing, getting a new house, a new car, new electronics, you would have to wait for them to decide to replace the gear that they let you use. You see how that shifts who the decision maker is. You're no longer the person in charge of your own property because it's no longer your property. This step exists in League of Nations mandates. Now, I've already talked to you about the Middle East, but I'm going to remind you of it. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire is carved up, not into League of Nations. Nah. Yeah, I think the pretense is of League of Nations mandates. The French are given Syria and Lebanon for two reasons. The French have a long-standing connection to the Maronite Christians of Lebanon, and the French needed a reward for their work on the Western Front. The French didn't do much of anything in the Middle East. But the British understood that the French had been holding the line on the Western Front while British forces fight in the Middle East. So the British were going to reward the French with Arab territory in Syria and Lebanon. The British get Palestine, which is Israel, Transjordan, which is Jordan, and Iraq, which is Iraq. And so the British are going to rule this arc of territory right along the Arabian border. And then the Syrians and the Lebanese are going to be under French rule. This is the agreement. You know who's not happy with this agreement? The Arabs. Lawrence of Arabia had gone along with the Arabs believing that the British had promised them that once the Ottoman Turks were driven out, the British would leave. And the Arabs would rule a unified Arab country that includes what is today Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Yemen. Basically, that whole region of the world between Egypt and Persia would come together as a United Arab Republic or a United Arab Kingdom, whatever, a caliphate. And the British and French betrayed them. And the Treaty of Versailles reflects this. The Treaty of Versailles also was going to carve Turkey up, and it gave Western Turkey to the Greeks, but the Turks changed. This is important for later. The Turks changed. The Ottoman Empire falls, and a new Turkish state is set up under the general of the Turks that held the British and French back at Gallipoli. His name is Mustafa Kemal. He renames himself Kemal Ataturk, which means father of all Turks. Kemal Ataturk, in the early 1920s, establishes the only secular Islamic society in history, except for a brief period under the Shah of Iran. From the 1920s until the late 1990s, Turkey was an Islamic country that was as European as it could be. Women were given full citizenship. Women were given the right to vote. There was multi-party politics. Kemal's National Party ruled Turkey. He basically ran things like a dictator. And he drove the Greeks out. And he fought for the Turkey that we know today. Well, at least the boundaries of the Turkey that we know today. Kemal does all of this because he sees Turkey's primitive backwardness as its problem. So Turkey's going to keep its Islamic culture, but it's not going to be ruled as a theocracy. It's going to be ruled like a modern European country. So from the 1920s until the late 90s, it is. Until an Islamist party under the current Turkish president takes over. And they are bringing Turkey back into the Dark Ages. That's one way of putting it. So there are the outlines of the Treaty of Versailles. Any questions about them? I see them. Okay. We're going to spend some time on this today and tomorrow. The legends that come out of the trenches are pretty powerful stuff. Because these legends are what everyday people believe about the war's significance. First off, the lost peace. Everyone had been told on all sides that the war was being fought for a transcendent good. The Germans were told that they were fighting for social imperialism, socialist imperialism, a welfare state system that is humane to workers and soldiers and under the emperor, that will dominate the center of Europe, the center of Africa, and will end up challenging Britain for dominance over the seas of the world. So that Germany will be number one. The Austrians are fighting for control of the Balkans from Serbia. The Russians are fighting to protect their little Slavic brothers and also to keep the Germans in check. The French are fighting for revenge, and they're fighting for Alsace-Lorraine, and they're fighting to break Germany up into component parts. The British are fighting for the Belgians, who were violated, whose territory was violated. The Belgians are fighting to get their country back. Ultimately, the Turks are fighting to become a modern country and to take over British Egypt and the Suez Canal. The Americans are fighting to pay the Germans back for promising Mexico our southwestern states, and also to stop the unrestricted U-boat attacks on American shipping, and to make the world safe for democracy. You just heard over the last few days what the Versailles Peace was like. Are any of those victory conditions achieved? Are any of those transcendent goods made manifest? I don't think so. And the Arabs are fighting for their unified state. They don't get it either. Everyone who looks at the peace sees it as a lost peace, sees it as a futile peace, sees it as an insult to the men and women who died. This is not the world they fought for. This is not the world they died for. Rupert Brooke would be spinning in his Flanders Fields grave over this kind of victory. All that hell for so little gain. You might as well not have fought the war. In fact, a major anti-war streak is going to develop in the United States, which takes an isolationist form. But the notion is that we were snookered into getting involved in World War I by British propaganda, and that we won't get fooled again. We will never again, this peace movement says, we will never again allow ourselves to be drawn into a foreign war. A useless, futile European conflict. Never again. That is the resolve of many Americans, both liberals and conservatives. The isolationism and anti-war movement was something that both liberals and progressives and conservatives, there weren't libertarians, then we get the idea, many of them at least, joined in with. There were some people who believed that involving yourself in the world was a good idea, but after this peace, it's an unpopular view. And then there's the lost generation. Eric Maria Remarque writes about this in his novel All Quiet on the Western Front. It's something that you would have seen if you saw the clips that I told you to see from it, or the movie itself. I think I told you to see the whole movie. It's easy, and this is something, by the way, that whenever you think about a genocide like the Holocaust, or what's happening to the Uyghurs right now, it's easy to imagine the dead. It's easy to imagine the bodies. So the lost generation, at first blush, seems to be a reference to those men who died. The men that George Orwell wrote about, the men with big chests and big mustaches who bestrode his youthful days. The men who made the British Empire. The men who were killed, selected to die. in the first years of the war. And there is that. The truth is, for the rest of the lives of everyone who remembers World War I, and this includes J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, it includes C.S. Lewis, it includes generation of prime ministers, everyone who lives through it sees Britain after World War I as a lesser country filled with lesser men, because the great men died. They went and they died, and they didn't come back. The men who came back were the men who ducked, not the men who stepped up. The British physiognomy got smaller, their health got more shaky for the next couple of generations. Literally, this is statistically backed up. The British as a people got smaller and less healthy because of those people with immense virility and immense health, vitality, they didn't come back to breed. So there's the lost generation of men who died. Easy to picture, just like it's easy to picture that the victims of the Holocaust were the 6 million Jews and the Gypsies and the homosexuals and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Christians, the Catholics and Protestants, and everyone else that was targeted by Hitler as Untermensch or subhuman or an enemy of the state. What his novel is all about isn't just the death. It's the loss of Paul Baumer years before he is shot by that sniper. It's the loss of the living. The men who they would have been are not because of their experiences in the war. What kind of world would there be if the people who had fought the war hadn't been traumatized by it? But they were. They were brutalized. They were inured to this vicious violence. Many of them had personal experiences taking an entrenching tool, that's a shovel, and axing it into somebody's neck and shoulder region. Or being spurted when their bayonet went into the chest or belly of another human being. Of fighting for their lives hand to hand. Of seeing people that they lived with and trained with cut down like wheat in human wave attacks against machine guns. Living with the constant threat of having a shell that you won't hear, or a bullet that you won't hear, because shells and bullets travel faster than sound. You don't hear the bullet that kills you. By the time the sound from that bullet snaps into your ears, you're either dead or you're not, or you're wounded or you're not. So at any moment, a shell could come out of nowhere and explode you, or collapse the dugout that you're in, or turn the trench that you're in into a grave. This changes people. You have 18-year-old men who have hair that's whiter than mine because of what they go through. Even those that come back seemingly normal are not the same men. Now, some of them will try to forget for the rest of their lives. They don't want to go to veterans group meetings. They don't want to march in any Veterans Day parade. They want to be left alone to live their lives like it never even happened. But you and I both know, or all know, that's living in Egypt, the land of denial. That's living in Paris, where if you fall into the river, you're insane. It is not mentally healthy to just imagine that, sorry, I couldn't help it, that years of your life, the most profound and horrific years of your life, never even happened. Given all of this, it shouldn't be any surprise that a new term enters the English language. Shell shock. And what shell shock is what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's when the nervous system of people simply break down. So you end up with physically healthy men who are clucking like chickens, standing on one leg, or banging their heads into cement walls, or chewing on their fingers as hard as they possibly can, who have completely lost touch with reality and are destructive of themselves and of others. Sometimes people seem healthy and normal until they have a flashback. These are men who were victims of the war, maybe for the rest of their lives, or until they find some way to deal with it. And psychology at the time didn't have any answers, and pharmacology didn't have any answers. The lost generation takes many forms. It's the dead, it's the living who come back changed, it's the people who come back insane, shell-shocked. But let's go 20 years forward. What kind of world would it have been if those millions and millions of men who had died had lived? I mean, not only is there the loss and grief from their death at such a young age, but what contributions could they have made? What diseases could they have cured? What ways of alleviating poverty could they have come up with? What new ways of doing things could they have done? What advances, what novels, what movies, what music could have been made by the dead, but wasn't because they were killed in this war? That's also the lost generation. The loss of those men and a few women who were not there for, quote, the rest of their natural lives, unquote. And this peace, this Versailles peace, does not justify it. Now, tomorrow I'm going to show you extended clips from this movie, The Razor's Edge, which is based on a novel by W. Somerset Maugham, a Brit. And it's going to talk about some guys from Chicago who end up having their lives changed as a result of the Great War. And it is considered to be by many the quintessential novel of the lost generation. And it's an interesting story. It's a good story. So we're going to see a bunch of it. Anyway, thank you for your time. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Thank you for your time. It is, by the way, the 1984 version. There are other versions. I think there's at least one other version that was made, but I'm showing this one. It's Bill Murray. Thank you. You can talk quietly.
Is that Bill Murray?
Bill Murray is in a dramatic role.
Is that him on the front?
Yeah, that's him on the front. Yeah. Does this look like Bill Murray? I think it does.
It looks like kind of. I guess he's young.
Well, he is. But he's also, again, it's weird seeing Bill Murray in a dramatic role. And it will be. There are things he does that I, instinctively almost laugh at because he's so established in my mind as a comedian. But there's some humor here, but there's also some seriousness. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you, folks.